A big hand for Stephen Schwartz.
You know, when they do these kinds of introductions, you really feel like you ought to be lying there with a lily. Well, Jay-Z asked me to come down and talk to you a little bit about what I have spent most of my life doing. And it's my pleasure to do so. And I really, I was very moved by seeing this extraordinary audience of people and all of you all who are out in the tent as well, because it struck me that one has to get something terribly meaningful out of an experience where you would come all the way across the world in the middle of a rainstorm in Yelm, Washington. And live in a tent. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the part of yourself that a lot of people think doesn't exist. The non-local part. And we use the term non-local to try to distinguish between that part of consciousness which is local to your neuroanatomy in your brain and that part of your consciousness which cannot be local. And we're going to do a little experience in a few minutes, and you can have an experience with that, although I know you have had a number already. And I'd like to frame this in two ways tonight. I'd like to frame it in the context of the ancient shamanic spiritual traditions, and also in the scientific world and the research that we are doing in science. Because what almost 50 years of research has taught me now is that there's only one mountain in town, and it's an illusion. So how you choose to get up it is largely a matter of style and personal taste. And that the conclusions that science is now arriving at about consciousness are in many ways a confirmation of the shamanic and spiritual traditions that have informed humanity from its earliest days. We know from the caves of Lascaux and Tres Frères and Fontagoum, caves that are decorated with artistic work that dates back 10, 20, 30,000 years. That from our earliest days, humanity has sought to understand the aspect of consciousness which we think of today as non-local. This is the part of us that is outside of space and time. This is the part that the near-death experience involves. This is the part that out-of-body experiences involve. This is the part that is involved with the most universal belief of all religious experiences, and that is the capacity to heal. From our various earliest days, as long as humanity has been keeping records, the idea that the consciousness of one person, usually described within the intermediary of God or spirits or whatever, can result in an effect on the well-being of another organism. And what all of this research is telling us, I think, as I read it, is that all consciousness is interlinked and interdependent. I'm going to talk about the individual first, but I'm going to close with how those individual experiences translate into social forces. Because I think we stand at a difficult and in some cases quite painful transition. We are at the beginning of another period of history. And these periods come along from time to time. From the 2nd to the 8th century BC, for instance, a period that is known as the axial period. It was within that relatively short space of time that humanity awoke, and that most of the great religions that we think of today actually began. They all trace from this one little bitty period of history. Confucianism, Buddhism, Thalian Greek philosophy, Zoroastrianism, all of these things and many more all begin in this one period. It was as if humanity had this awakening. And we are different on the other side. And I think in some ways we are at one of those great transitional epochs again. So let me start with the individual and what we know. And what I'm going to talk to you about is entirely based on research. I am a data person. My interest is in data, experiments. I'm an experimentalist. And so I'm interested in things which can be tested and verified. And I'll try to identify that for you, and I'll also give you places where you can get additional information, because I have a relatively limited time, and this is a very broad subject. And perhaps we could start with remote viewing, because I was here this morning, and you all were doing that. We're going to do a couple, at least one, maybe two tonight. But since you started with that, I thought, well, that might be a good place to start. The term remote viewing, by the way, is a relatively modern one. It was coined by a New York artist and one of the early people who participated in remote viewing research. Those of us who we really began in the late 60s and early 70s. Ingo Swann coined the term. It's not really a very good term, because it's, as you all know from having done it, it's not really about viewing, and remoteness is irrelevant. But we didn't understand very well in the early days. The earliest remote viewing, interestingly enough, dates from about the 5th century BC and can be found in the 46th chapter of Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek gentleman who traveled around the world, of his world at that time, and he describes what he saw. It's a fascinating book because it gives us a good description of what the classical world was like. And the first remote viewing that ever exists in the literature of humanity is recorded in Herodotus, and it describes a remote viewing done pretty much as we would do it today. It's what's called an outbound experiment protocol. And it was done by King Croesus, who is the king that we think of as being as rich as. And the reason we think about Croesus as being rich is that he was the first ruler to coin gold and silver coinage. And so as rich as Croesus. But in this instance, Croesus, who was the king of the Lydians, got word that he was going to be attacked by the Persians. And the Persians were big and he was small, and that was pretty scary. He was also very depressed. He'd just lost a son. And he thought, well, what in the world can I do to get guidance? And so he decided that he would go to the 7 oracles of the ancient world, who were scattered all over. One was in Siwa in the Egyptian Libyan desert, and of course the one that we know best is the Oracle of Delphi. But there were 7 oracles, and so he assembled 7 embassies, 7 groups of people, and he told all of them, he gathered them all in his palace, and he said to them, go out, and on the 100th day, you are, and not before, you are to go into the oracle and you are to ask, what is Croesus doing? And so the 7 oracles went out. They didn't have any idea what he had in mind, and they waited for the 100th day. And the only one that we know, the only answer we know, because it was the correct one and was recorded, was that of Delphi. Now, the Oracle of Delphi, the remains of which still exist, you can see, and Delphi worked because they took young girls who were intuitively gifted and they hung them in a kind of tripod thing over cracks in the earth from which hydrocarbon vapors came up and put the girls into an altered state of consciousness. Most of these oracular traditions involve some aspect of that, and it's still going on today, by the way. You can look at, for instance, the Kogi in Colombia, who take young boys who are selected by shamans and put them in a cave and keep them there for about 12 years, training them to open to this aspect of consciousness, and then they bring them out into the light, into the culture, and they are the guides that this tribal group uses to direct their choices. I think the Maya did something quite similar, trained a cadre of shamans, and that's where the 2012 prophecies come from, and if I have a chance, I'll speak a little bit about that. But in any case, so when the Oracle of Delphi, when the embassy got there, when they walked into the presence of the Pythoness, that's what these young girls were called, before they even had a chance to ask their question, the young Pythoness said, I can count the sands, in other words, the 100 days, and I see a great bronze urn, big pot, and a great bronze lid, and a ram and a cock, and heat, great flames. And so they wrote all this down as Croesus had told them, and they went home, and when they got back, all the embassies were gathered again, and when Croesus heard this one, he bowed down and gave obeisance to Delphi because on the 100th day, he thought to himself, what is the most unkingly thing a king could be doing? And he had a great tripod brought into the courtyard of his palace and a fire built and a great bronze pot brought in, and he personally killed and threw in the cock and the ram and put the lid on. Exactly what they had described. And this basic protocol, this outbound protocol it's called, is a protocol where you send somebody out and they hide someplace and then people try to describe them. And it's one of the protocols that we developed. But the point I want to leave you with in this is that this idea of the protocol, because it's in the idea of the protocol that the shamanic and scientific traditions come together. If you think of all of the world's religious ceremonies, put aside the dogma, the belief structures about it, just what they do, you can see that they all pretty much have the same, a kind of universal approach. You gather in a place that is designated as the place, and that's true whether it's a sacred grove or a synagogue or a mosque or a church. You gather there, that's the appointed place. You make a statement of intention. This is very important. I noticed last night and then this morning when Jay-Z was speaking, when Ramtha was speaking, this picture here where it says you can do anything, the key is focus. That is absolutely correct based on the scientific research and the shamanic research, because you make a statement of intention. If you're a Christian, for instance, you say the Nicene Creed. It is what is happening in that gathering process, and you can think of the ceremony as a kind of protocol. That's what a ritual is. It is a way of preparing you to open to the non-local aspect of your consciousness. So you gather in a designated place, you make a statement of intention, there is some drumming or chanting or singing. Why? Because we know from a lot of research that this causes brain entraining. That is, everybody's brain begins to show the same kind of patterns. You are linking together through the intention that you commonly hold. And then there is a period of time where you get to express this open consciousness, this non-local aspect. If you are a charismatic Christian, for instance, it would be what are called the gifts of the Spirit, glossolalia or something like that. Or if you were, for instance, a practitioner of voodoo, it would be possession by one of the voodoo gods. There is this period of time within the community where the community is linked in common intention, where individuals are allowed to open to this part of themselves. And after it is done, after that experience happens, there is a rededication experience which you take away with you. Well, now, that's the shamanic pattern. In the techniques that we use in the laboratory, although we don't talk about it this way, of course, we do the same thing. You come into the laboratory, which is the designated space where you're going to have the experience. There is an experiencer. There is a monitor, for instance, where the monitor is going to help you have this experience. And you have a series of steps you go through in order to open to this aspect of your consciousness. And this, the non-local, is important individually, because this aspect of consciousness, the part of us which is not in space-time, what the great neuroscientist Wilder Penfield said in a book called Mysteries of the Mind, at the end he said, after 30 years of researching the brain, and he was the original person who started mapping the brain and stimulating brains, people's living brains, and seeing what happened. After 30 years of examining the brain, I am forced to conclude that whatever the mind is, it is not just the brain. And, I mean, that was a pretty radical thing for a neuroscientist to say, but actually you could find that same thing in the 2nd century BC in the Sutras of Patanjali. Patanjali may or may not have been a single person. He's rather like Homer in Hindu culture. He is the compiler of the sutras involving yogis, the founder of yoga. And he was about 150 BCE to about 200 BCE. Anyway, other way around, 201. But if you look at his sutras, you will see this same idea of being able to open to this aspect of consciousness outside of space-time. You can find it in the Neoplatonic philosophies of Plotinus, who is the founder of Neoplatonism. Plotinus is about 400 years later. He's about 200 AD, 220 to 270, I think. Also talking about this same transcendent part of ourselves. The Edgar Cayce material as a more modern example of this. This is the part of us that has moments of religious epiphany. This is the part of us that has moments of creative genius. Brahms says, I am in an altered state of consciousness, and in that consciousness, I hear the music. I write it down. Mozart, same thing. In fact, Mozart apparently heard it so clearly and perfectly that when you look at the compositions, his compositions, if you look at most composers, it's kind of like looking at any writer. You know, there's a little bit, and then there's scratched out, and then there's an arrow that goes up here, and there's another little piece, and then there's more scratched out, and another little piece. Mozart's compositions don't look at all like that. They look like the final engrossing. Normally what composers at that time did was they'd scratch all this out, and then they'd give a mass of sheets to somebody who would make one clean copy of the whole thing without all the scratches. Mozart's have almost no changes. Interestingly enough, I saw on 60 Minutes, not just a couple of weeks ago, a young boy who's at the Juilliard School of Music in New York, who's just a young boy, and he's doing exactly the same thing. He says, I hear the music and I just write it down. This is the place, this is the aspect of consciousness that Einstein talks about, how the theories of relativity came to him. Tesla says, I was walking across the park when I saw the electric motor. And I went home and I went back to my laboratory and I had people make the drafts and we built it. That is, they didn't experiment with it over and over again. It just came. And when you look at the words of the people to whom we accord the title genius, creative genius, over and over again, they will describe this sense of being in a timeless time, a spaceless space, where they are connected with a larger totality. This is the same thing that great psychics talk about, that you're in a timeless time, a spaceless space. This is when you are on the shamanic vision quest and you reach that place where you are in the timeless time and the spaceless space and you see all of the interconnectedness. And what you come away with from this research is that creative genius and spiritual epiphany and remote viewing are all the same thing. They are opening to the non-local aspect of consciousness. So let me take a minute and talk about what we know about the non-local. We don't know very much, by the way. We're only beginning to really get a handle on it, and it's in the last 20 years, particularly certainly since the 70s, but really in the last 20 years that things are developing so quickly. A first question one might ask is consciousness, this non-local aspect of consciousness, electromagnetic? That is it like a radio wave that goes out from us? Is there a sender and a receiver and a signal? The answer is, it is not electromagnetic. How do we know this? Well, we know this because first a Russian physiologist named Leonid Vasiliev began a series of experiments where he put people down into caves and mine shafts, and he put them in Faraday cages. That's a kind of metal cage that blocks out electromagnetic radiation. And Vasiliev, who was an academician in the Soviet Union, an academician is a special title, a kind of internal Nobel There are only 300 of them there were only 300 in the whole Soviet Union, and now there are even less now that that's broken up. So this is a very exalted kind of academic title, position. And Vasilyev was an excellent researcher. And he took the whole electromagnetic spectrum and he designed experiments that eliminated little pieces of it, one by one. And he discovered that it didn't make any difference when he put people down in the caves or put them in the mine shafts, and he asked them to describe things that were as much as 1,700 kilometers away. Didn't make any difference. They did just as well as when they were on the surface. And he finally got down to one little piece of the EM spectrum called ELF, extreme low frequency. And he said the only way that you could understand this, that this could be the explanation, would be you'd have to put somebody down in a submarine because seawater shields ELF. And he went to Admiral Gorshkov, who was the head of the Soviet Navy, and he asked Admiral Gorshkov if he could do that, and he couldn't do it. Now, at that point, this was in the earlier 60s, and so at this point in the early 70s, about 1970, I was the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, a man named Elmo Zumwalt. And I had friends over at the CIA who were feeding me these classified translations of Vasilyev's work. And I thought, well, I'll go ask Hyman Rickover, who is the father of the American submarine nuclear fleet. And as it happened, I had a chance to fly up to Groton, Connecticut with him. And I put it to him, would he let me go aboard one of the boomers, one of the missile subs, while it was doing its sea trials and conduct a series of experiments to do this. And he thought about it for a minute and said, I can't do that. The media will get hold of it and nobody will understand this. And so that's where it lay until 3 years later. I was in Los Angeles, and two friends of mine who were deep ocean engineering people called me up and said, we have a submarine that's coming down to Santa Catalina Island, and we'll give you 3 days of this sub to test your idea. And as it had happened, the Navy had just spent $125 million calculating exactly how deep you had to go to get beyond ELF range, because they wanted to use ELF to communicate with, they do use ELF to communicate with the submarines, and they only wanted them to come up a little ways so that they couldn't be detected by satellites by the heat of their reactors. So I knew exactly how deep you had to get to answer this final question that Vasilyev had posed. And so I had 11 people who agreed to participate, remote viewers. I sent them all a chart of the Santa Catalina waters off the coast of Los Angeles, and I asked them to locate a previously unknown wreck on the sea floor. And I also decided that would be reaching in through the seawater, that we would hang people in the submarine at a depth below the ELF range, and we would see if they could do essentially the same outbound experiment that Croesus had carried out. That is, somebody would be hidden somewhere in California and people would attempt to describe it. And it worked. We found a previously unknown wreck on the sea floor, which was confirmed by the Marine Sites Board of the Bureau of Land Management. And we put people down in the submarine and asked them to find the hidden people, and it also worked. We made a film out of this, which you can still see on television. But the important point here is that answered the question, is it electromagnetic? That is this a radio phenomena? Is there something we're sending out? The idea of telepathy was coined, the word itself was coined by a man named Frederick Meyer, an English researcher, in the end of the 19th century, I think 1887. And I believe that this idea of signals and senders and receivers arose because the same people that were doing the early consciousness research were also people doing the work to develop telegraphy and telephony and telephones, radios, all of that, telegraph. And it is the nature of humanity to try to find explanatory models for what's going on. And so to them, this looked a lot like the same kind of thing they were doing with telephones and radios. And so the idea of telepathy, as if someone is sending a signal out and somebody else is getting it, that sort of thing, took hold, and it dominated consciousness research for almost half a century. But what we learned from the submarine experiment, Deep Quest, was that it can't be a signal. That's just one aspect, but it couldn't be a signal. And so we began to think about a different way of conceptualizing this. Now, I think a lot of this will be very familiar to you, although my terms will be different, because what I know about the Ramtha material suggests that this is also pretty much what the Ramtha source is also saying. And it's also what you'd find in Patanjali, and it's what you'll find in Plotinus and lots of other people. Over and over, people have been getting this insight. The difference is this time that we're coming at it from a slightly different direction. I don't want to give you the sense that this is embraced by everyone in science. There is, in fact, a huge denier movement. And in fact, there are 3 denier movements that are going on. There is the evolution denier movement. About 50% of Americans believe the world was created within the last 6 to 10,000 years in 6 days. And it isn't like they actually know better, and that, when they're lying in bed with their spouse saying, I know that's what we say, but we all know. No, that's what they believe. Unfortunately, to believe that, you have to throw out all of anthropology, paleontology, geology, astrophysics, physics. You have to discard. It is a form of willful ignorance. And it's very dangerous. So, when I get to the social part in a little while, I'll pick this thought up, but I just want to make this point here. There are these 3 movements. The environmental, that's the anti-climate change people. No, it's not climate change, it's just, it's not getting warmer because there was a snowstorm where I am. An inability to distinguish between weather and climate. There is the anti-evolution denier movement. This may surprise you, but there was a period during the Bush administration where the Park Service was not allowed, when asked, how old is the Grand Canyon, to give a correct answer. And this was because of the political power of the anti-evolutionist forces. This is maybe personally irritating, but it has social consequences. And the third denier movement is the consciousness denier movement. Those are the people who maintain that we're just animated meat. Dead meat, no consciousness. And it is astonishing how resistant people are to changing. I think you all must have some personal experience. So if it's not electromagnetic, what is non-local consciousness? Well, as I said, there are many questions and only a few answers. But there are a few answers. First of all, the non-space-time domain, and by the way, it is extraordinarily difficult to talk about this because our language is completely embedded in space-time. I have one of my books out there, Opening to the Infinite, which is my latest book. I wrote that book 18 times because I would write it and I'd put it aside for a while. Anybody who writes understands this. And then I would pick it up again and read it after it sort of went cold. And I'd be going along and I'd think, my God, this thing is completely entrapped in space-time. The words are hard to use. For instance, you hear people talk about dimensions. Dimensions is a spatial term. They talk about this sender, signal, receiver thing. Space-time words. The best word that I can come up is domain. And what the research, I believe, is telling us is that the non-space-time domain is a domain of information. And there are experimental reasons, which I will get into, as why I believe this is true. Well, let me say a little bit about it. I have been interested for a long time in therapeutic intention. That is, the idea that the consciousness of one person can have a therapeutic effect on the well-being of another organism. And I could have spent all my time tonight just talking about this little piece of it, but I'm trying to give you a broader overview. And almost university healers will talk to you about sending energy. It's all explained in energetic terms. There is a problem with this. Well, there are a number of problems, but I'll illustrate the problem with an experiment. This is an experiment that was published in the British Medical Journal not very long ago. It was carried out by a man named Leonard Libovici, who was an immunologist in Israel, a very well-known, very senior researcher, and he really didn't like therapeutic intention research. He thought the whole idea of healing was nonsense. And so he decided to construct an experiment that was so tightly controlled that it would be impossible, if it worked, it would be impossible for it to work other than that it invoked something about non-local consciousness. So here's the experiment. This is one of my favorite experiments, by the way. And then I'm going to tell you about another one. This is why I think about why I believe. When I say it's the non-local domain is informational, not energetic. Well, you have every reason to believe. Well, how do you know that? I mean, that's a reasonable question. And the answer is in these experiments, which I'm going to share with you. In the Libovici experiment, in order to make it go away, which is what he thought would happen, he went to his computer at the hospital, the Beth Israel Medical Center where he was, and he asked the computer to give him all of the people who had contracted a blood infection, an iatrogenic infection they got while they were in the hospital, between 1994, let's see, I've got to get the dates right, 4 to 10 years, 2000. between 1994 and 1996. '90 and 1994. 4 to 10 years in the past. In the past, stick with me on this one. This is a hard experiment, by the way. It took me 3 days to figure this out and really get it. So if smoke starts coming out of your ears, it won't surprise me. Anyway, so here's the experiment. So he asked the computer to give him just, not any information, just how many cases were there where people had contracted this blood infection 4 to 10 years in the past. It turned out there were 3,392 cases where people had contracted this particular problem. And so he had the computer randomly select out of that larger body 2 populations of 1,000 each. One to be the treated population, one to be the control population. And you all are familiar, I'm sure, with the double-blind protocol, the idea that people are blind and there are control populations. Double-blind protocol, by the way, was created by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, when he was the minister for the rebellious colonies in 1776 to 1789. I'm sorry I keep getting stuck on these dates. I'm trying to do all this from memory. King Louis XVI was very concerned because Marie Antoinette had gotten very enamored of Mesmer, the creator of hypnosis, and Mesmer was asking her for a lot of money, and he didn't have any money. He was mostly broke, the king, and so he appointed a commission. It's the first commission to study consciousness a second commission to study consciousness that I know of in history. And there was a very prestigious group. Lavoisier was part of that. Guillotin, who was the father of the guillotine. And, well, he meant well. Anyway, he appointed this very prestigious committee of guys, and Franklin was then a very elderly man, and he was suffering from gout, and he couldn't come to their meetings in Paris. He was in Passy, and they couldn't make any headway with Mesmer. They couldn't figure out how to study him to answer Louis' question. Was animal magnetism real? So they finally wrote Franklin and said, what do we do? And Franklin said, well, I can't come to you, so you all come to me. And so they all came out, and Franklin created what is now the basic experiment, the gold standard experiment for all medical research, the double-blind protocol. And the reason we call it the blind protocol is that he blindfolded people. And he had 2 groups of people, and one the control group, one the treated group. And he had Mesmer's student, Deslin, another physician. Some of the people he treated correctly, and some of the people he just went through the motions. And the task was, could the people tell which was which? Could they accurately do that? And they could not. But anyway, that's where the blind protocol comes from, and why we call it the blind protocol, because they blindfold them. And because people are blind to what's happening. Anyway, so Libovici, he's now got these 2,000 people, right? Treated population, control population. And he has a group of people Now remember, they were all out of the hospital. This is 4 to 10 years in the past. Stick with that. He then had a group of healers come in, and they were given the first name and the initial of the surname of the people in the treated population. And they prayed that they simply had experienced health, that they were healthy and well. The healers didn't know anything about this. They didn't know what was wrong with the people. They didn't know that this was all in the past. All these people were already out of the hospital. And what he discovered was that the people who were in the treated population had a different course of experience than the people who were in the control population. Now think about that for a minute. They were reaching back in time 4 to 10 years to send healing to people in the past whose whatever had happened to them had already happened to them. Right? Now here's the kicker. You cannot go back and change the past. You cannot. What you can do is you can go back into the past when it is the present and make things come out a certain way. Now, the key thing to this Libovici experiment was that nobody knew the answer to what had happened. They were all blind to this. Had they known, they couldn't have done it. You have to be blind to it in order to reach back into the past when it was the present to influence it to come out a certain way. Let me illustrate this with another experiment. This is an experiment done by a German researcher working in Italy named Elmer Gruber. And Elmer got interested in this issue of retrocausality, which is what this is called. And he devised a very interesting experiment. He got one of those counters, those things that you put on the roadway and you drive over them, and it goes click, click. You see them all the time. They figure out where they're going to put stoplights. He put one across the roadway and the entrance to a tunnel. And he recorded the clicks that were made by the cars going over. Click, 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 front axle, back axle, click, 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 like that. And he recorded them for 6 months. But he did not play them. Then, after waiting another 6 months, he brought people into his laboratory. He didn't tell them anything about the backstory, that there was a thing over the road and the cars went over and made the clicks, nothing. What he said to them was, I'm going to play you a series of clicks. And before you hear the clicks, I'm going to ask my computer, using a random number generator, to tell me whether the clicks should be more frequent or less frequent. In other words, your task is to make more clicks occur or less clicks occur. Now remember, he has 6 months of recording of clicks. Half-hour segments. Each session was a half an hour. I'm going to play these clicks for you for a half an hour, right? So he had 180 half hours, let's say from 3 to 3:30 in the afternoon. So he had 183 to 3:30 periods in the afternoon. Everybody have this? And so if you did an analysis, you could figure out what was the baseline of clicks. That's the basis. And then he brought people in. Now, this all happened, that happened afterwards. No one had heard the clicks. I'm going to play these clicks for you. Your task is to make more clicks or less clicks. And so he had a group of people do this. And after they had done it, he then went back and did an analysis of each of those half-hour periods. He had 180 of half hours of each time because the times were randomly selected. And what he discovered was that for the half hours that were the target of the intention of the participants in the experiment, if he graphed it, it went like this. Or people were able to make the clicks become more or less than would have been the baseline of all the other half hours for that period. Now think about that for a minute. In order for there to be more clicks, there had to be more automobiles. In order for there to be more automobiles, somebody had to be driving the automobiles. And so what was actually happening, if you think about it, is that somebody 6 months in the future was sitting there listening to clicks, making them go up and down, and 6 months earlier, some guy was turning to his wife and saying, "Rosina, I think I'm going downtown to get some more cigarettes and I'll go through the tunnel." Because the only way that could happen, that there could be more clicks or less clicks, was that there had to be more cars or less cars. Which meant that consciousness of the participants who had that intention had to be linked to the consciousness of the people who were driving those cars. Oh, it gets much stranger. A German researcher working at the Mind Science Foundation down in Austin, Texas, or San Antonio, Texas, named Helmut Schmidt, was also interested in this question. He, in fact, his research is what had got Elmer started. Helmut had a slightly different protocol, because I am sure it has already occurred to you to ask, well, maybe it wasn't the cars, maybe it was non-local perturbation that was affecting the recordings of the clicks, right? That's the question. I can see all these heads. Yeah. Just wait. So Helmut, the way he went about it was, he got a nuclear isotope that was emitting particles, right? And he put sensors around the isotope that recorded the particles hitting the sensors, making clicks. And he made 6 copies of the data on 6 separate chips. And he took 5 of the chips and he sent them off to other researchers and he said, just put this in a drawer someplace and forget about it. And I'll get back to you if I need to. And then he kept 1 chip for himself and he brought people in and he did the same thing. He said, I'm going to play a bunch of clicks for you. I want you to make more clicks or less clicks. And once again, they could do it. Now, he asked that question. Is it possibly that the participants are just somehow non-locally perturbing the structure of the chip, little computer chip, and that there really isn't any difference, that that's where the event is occurring? Well, the answer, of course, would be that if the other 5 chips, which had never been played, were different than that 1 chip, he would be able to answer that question. You see why? So he called up his friends that he had sent the chips to and said, send them back to me. And when he played them, lo and behold, all of the chips showed the same change. No, we're not through. So then he asked, well, this is a collapse of the vector. This is a collapse of a part of the world line. So what would happen if I exposed the information to the chips to another kind of organism? Not a human being. And he settled on a fish. And he had a very elegant experiment. I just love elegant experiments. You know, they're hard to design these things where you close all the little loopholes. And so when people are good at it, I mean, it's an art form. It's very elegant. It's like looking at a beautiful piece of, or listening to a beautiful piece of music, or looking at a beautiful painting. So this is his experiment. He got this fish, he put the fish in a fish bowl or a fish tank, and around the edge of the fish tank, he put little electrical points that would discharge a small charge of electricity, which would not hurt the fish, but it would react with it. It gave it a little stimulation. And he then did the same experiment, only before he had the people try to do it, he played the chips for the fish with no other person present. He just recorded it. And they played the chip, and whenever the chip made had a click, which represented a particle, there was a little stimulation of the fish. And then he tried to do it. What do you think happened? It didn't work. Why? Because any interaction with this information collapses the timeline and it can no longer be changed. The non-local domain is an informational domain. In Leibovici's experiment, the reason that healing is both local and non-local is that there is no way to send energy back in time. But you can send information back. Now let me talk about another class of experiments. These are called the presentment experiments, and they address this issue of information and our interactions with it. And there's about 26 of these experiments now. I'm going to tell you a couple of them, but they're all pretty much the same. The protocols are a little different, but it's pretty much the same. The first one is an experiment done by James Spottiswoode and Edwin May. And by the way, if you search on these people's names, you'll go to their websites and their papers are there. And also, let me write this down so that you got it. That's an M. If you go to my personal website, StephanASchwartz.com, you can not only get all of my papers, but you can get the bibliographies that I have put up there. There's a remote viewing bibliography, there is a healing bibliography, and by the end of the week there will be a presentment bibliography. And these are all these experiments that I'm telling you about. So you can get all these experiments. And if you search on the names of the people I'm giving you, you can go to their sites and they can get all of their papers. So let me start with this presentment series. The presentment idea is to ask a very straightforward question. Is it possible that before you cognitively are aware of a stimulus that you are going to receive, that your body responds to it first? Well, you already know that, but those of us who didn't had to work real hard to work it out. So here's this experiment. I'm going to tell you two of them. The first is a sound experiment. People are sitting there with headphones on, and they're hearing white noise. And periodically, based on a random number generator, so that nobody knows when it's going to occur, a loud noise occurs. And what they discover, they're looking at people's brain waves that they're pulling off with a sophisticated EEG system. They discover that just a few seconds before people hear the noise, their brainwave patterns change. That is, they are going down the timeline into their own future, and they're non-locally aware of this stimulus that is coming down, and it's a few seconds before it actually happens. Another one of these experiments, this particular one was done by Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. The first one I mentioned was done by the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory, where I'm a research associate of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research, the sound experiment. In this experiment that Dean did, you're sitting in front of a monitor. Periodically, a picture occurs. Again, it's randomly selected when that's going to happen. And there is a macro camera looking at the iris of your eye. Same thing happens. Before the picture occurs, your eye dilates. You don't know the picture is coming. No one knows the picture exactly when the picture is coming, but you do know, your body knows, before your mind, your local mind knows. And there's one other part of this, and that is the nature of the picture. When the picture evokes a stronger emotional response, there is more dilation. And that I want to get into because there are, as I said to you, a few things we know about how to work with the non-local. And those three things are intention, attention. Maybe I should write these down. Intention, attention. All right, numinosity. An entropic process. All right, I'll do each one in turn. The intention, attention one, which you see reflected in Ramtha's "You can do anything if the key is focus," is the difference between looking and seeing. Intention is an expression of an intent of the will, and it focuses attention. We have discovered in research that the single most important thing you can develop if you want to open to this part of yourself is meditation. Now, there are any number of ways to meditate. If you go to my site, I will give you a technique of meditation which is called Meditation for Modern Minds, which is specifically developed for modern minds, because most of the meditation techniques developed a long time ago in a very different world, in a world where most people didn't travel more than 5 to 10 miles from the place they were born, as opposed to coming thousands of miles to live in a tent and a... The colors they saw were mostly earth tones, and the loudest stimulation they got was maybe a drum or a bell, or the whole stimulation of the pre-industrial world was very, very different. Those of you who are backpackers, and I assume there are a lot of you because of all those tents, actually, let me ask this as a question. How many people who have been backpacking, who have gotten away from the 60-cycle electromagnetic fields that we live most of our lives in? Right now, we're in the middle of a 60-cycle electromagnetic field. It's all those wires that are in the walls and the lights and all that. We spend most of our time living in an electromagnetic field. And then on top of that, we are bombarded with television, radio, cell phones, and all that. None of that was true in the pre-industrial world. So if you're a backpacker, and let me form this, as I say, as a question, how many people here have noticed that on the third day of a backpack, your senses seem to be much sharper? It's like you go through a window. Ah, yes, okay. My wife and I used to call this going through the window, where you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden all the colors are brighter and the sounds are sharper, and because your body has re-equilibrated with the Earth's cycles as opposed to these human-made electromagnetic cycles, right? So we're constantly being bombarded with all of this, and therefore the meditation techniques that worked 2,000 years ago need to be modified to deal with the kind of world that we live in. But whatever meditation that you use, and I have tried all kinds of meditations. I've been a daily meditator for 50 years. And because I'm always trying them, and so all of them work. Because the key to meditation is that you develop the discipline of sitting for a period each day, and you hold a clear intention. If you use a mantra or an affirmation or an image, all of those things are designed to shape intention and to develop this practice of inner listening. And what we discover in the remote viewing research, in the healing research, in the presentment research, less in the presentment research because it really is precognitive, that is, it's not a cognitive activity, is that those people who meditate do better. And so actually, if I don't leave you with anything else tonight but this one sentence, it is develop the daily practice of meditation. It will transform your life. I'm sure there are many meditators in this room who would vouchsafe that, but if you are not a daily meditator, let me encourage you to find a technique that works for you. That's what we do here. Well, as you probably know then, it is at once the simplest and the most difficult thing you've ever done. I think of all the people that began meditation classes of one kind or another with me, and when I see them, I ask, are you still maintaining your practice? And I would say less than 10% say yes. It's a difficult practice to take control of the reactive local mind. The robots don't like it. Those, I think of them as apps, like computer apps, little things you put on your phone and everything. We come in, humanity comes in with a relatively blank slate. If you think about the pets that you have, I had a pet chicken. A little chicken about that big, a little miniature, part Cochin and part Seabright, had little feathered feet, about that big, who traveled, for a period of about 5 years, I lived on a bus, like a band would travel around in. And I had this little chicken, and I house trained her, and I had a pussy cat, and the little chicken sat on the back of my chair as I would write. And I discovered, as those of you who have had close relationships with animals, was that although she was a chicken and was limited by pre-programming that was hardwired in, within that structure, she had a very distinct personality. But at 5 o'clock, she had to be up off the ground no matter what. Because that's what her programming said. We humans, who take a very long time, if you think about it, you look at all these nature programs that are on the television, and you see all these animals that get born, and then 20 minutes later, they're off with whatever the herd's doing. Humanity isn't like that. We are completely helpless, and we just lie there like little lumps for months and months. Because we come in with a very sophisticated neuroanatomy, but not much programming. And we get programmed. And it starts very early. You only have to put your hand on a hot stove once. You never have to learn that again. That little program gets written in, and for the rest of your life, when you look at a stove, you think to yourself, is that hot or not? Well, those are good ones. But in the course of our life, we also get programmed by our parents and our greater culture and our peer group as to how we are going to react to people who are a different color, or people who come from a different religion, or who are in a different socioeconomic group, or anything, belong to a different political party, whatever. And these robots, these patterns that we get inculcated into us, they run most of our lives. There was a study done a number of years ago at the University of Chicago that suggested that most people have about 18 minutes out of every 24 hours of actually original thought. And I've known people who had considerably less. Most of what we're doing most of the time is completely robotic behaviors. This is a very unusual group, and so even you guys out in the tent. So this group is perhaps not as applicable to this group as some others, but most of what we're doing is reactive behavior most of the time. To reclaim that That is a program that takes some of your life force and directs it. And these programs exist only in space-time. And so they, as memories, are information. And so they run our lives. And if we want to open to this aspect of the non-local, if we want to open to who we really are, we have to reclaim these programs. There are a number of ways to get at this, but the most powerful and effective one that I know, as I said, is that you be a daily meditator. Because meditation will almost sort of indirectly reabsorb this energy. I say this sometimes to groups and they say, no, I'm not reactive. And I say to them, really? Take off your wristwatch and put it on the other wrist. Come back and tell me tomorrow how reactive you are. Take your wallet out and put it in another pocket. If you want to know what your spiritual valence is, as it were, become aware of how you react when somebody cuts you off on the freeway. When people talk about living in the now, when I first read that years ago, I thought, what in the world does this mean? I'm in the now. I'm responding in the now. No. What we're talking about is that you are responding to the immediate sensory input. You are not being guided by what happened when you were a child or what you think is going to happen in the future. You know, most of us in our fantasies of the future have very clear pictures of what's going to happen. And then when it actually does, we discover everybody else has got a different script. Because we're all the star of our own movies. In order to learn to open to this part of yourself, you have to move into a place where the robots are not running your consciousness. This is the part of us that, again, that is the source of creative genius. This is the source of spiritual epiphanies, and this is the source that we call psychic, a word I really don't like. Until about, well, if you date it from Galileo in the 1600s, until about 400 or 500 years ago, there was no way to experience the non-local except in the context of religious spiritual terms. There wasn't any other way to talk about it. I mean, you literally couldn't talk about it. There were no words. It's only in the last couple of centuries, 400 years, that as science has developed, we've been able to develop objective terms to describe this. And so I mention this because once you get this, and once you understand this, the connection between ritual and protocol, you realize that the protocols of experimentalists, much like myself, are essentially rituals. We don't call them that. In fact, many would be offended to call them that, but that's what they are. They are a way of approaching, opening to this aspect of yourself. And I use the word opening very deliberately. You can see why the lotus is such a powerful symbol in so many of the world's religions, because it is a flower that comes out of the muck of space-time and that reaches up into another domain and flowers into this beautiful flower. And empirically, that imagery is a representation of the process of the ritual, or, in science, the protocol. That all of this is about opening to this part of ourselves and becoming more completely who we are. It is the deepest and strongest urge of all humanity to understand, who am I? Why am I here? And what am I about? And the answer to this arises from learning how to open to this part of yourself. If you look at the near-death work, the work of Bruce Grayson or Ken Ring or Mel Morris, I'm sure I'm leaving, Jim Tucker, I'm sure I'm leaving somebody out, but the near-death researchers, and you look at the accounts that they record of the tunnel. Actually, not everybody has the tunnel experience, a relatively small percentage do, but this sense of opening up into this greater space where you encounter people who are near or dear to you, or God figures that are important to you. You see this business of opening. It's not sending or receiving, it's opening. It is available to us all the time. The capacity, as a natural capacity, is spread through the population like any other human ability. Just as there are certain people who are gifted musicians, or gifted mathematicians, or linguists, or artists, so there are people who are just naturally gifted at doing this. It's a bell curve. It looks like a bell. That's the point. And there are a few people at this end who are really gifted. You know, I could play golf for the end of time and Tiger Woods would never have to worry. And at this end are a few people who either cannot or will not give themselves permission to have the experience. The deniers fall at that group. I once had dinner with the best of the skeptics. There is a difference, by the way, as long as I'm into this, there is a difference between a skeptic and a denier. Skeptic comes from the Greek word skeptos, and what it means is to doubt and inquire. Under those terms, I'm a skeptic. I question a lot of things, and that's why I do experiments. I want to inquire. That is the true position of the inquiring personality. A denier is a person who has absolutely no doubt it can't possibly be true. I got an email this morning from another scientist who has done a brilliant study which has just been rejected by a journal on the grounds that it can't possibly be true. Not, we looked at your data and we don't agree, or your protocol had some kind of problem, but simply, it can't be true. Or as one scientist said, I wouldn't believe it if it was true. So those are those guys. But most of us fall somewhere in the middle here, right? We're in here. There are two parts of opening to the non-local. The native ability that you have, and it's whatever you're born with, whatever you have chosen to incarnate with, and it is moderated or modulated by the intention and development of disciplines which will allow you to open to this part of yourself. You may not have as strong an inherent gift as someone else, but if you put yourself to the practice of those techniques which will allow you to open your consciousness in this way, you will be able to do as well as the gifted person. Maybe they do it more effortlessly, but you can do it. We know from remote viewing studies, I did some, actually back in the 80s, I did 2 national tests in Omni magazine, one in Omni Japan and Omni America, testing these ideas, and Dean Radin has a program, an online test that you can take. You can go there. Noetics has got it up on their website where you can do online, or you can go to the Parapsychological Association, and they have a tab which has online tests or things you can do. But what we have learned is that this is an ability like any other human ability. And there are these 2 parts, your innate ability to do it and your training that you develop that will allow you to express this capacity within yourself. And that meditation is the single most determinate practice we've been able to find, because it focuses intention and attention. Now, numinosity. The term was coined by a German philosopher and theologian in the 19th century, but the definition really was refined by the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who said noumena, information, are psychic entia that are not limited by space-time. Numinosity is the informational richness of an information structure, usually an emotional reaction. We know, for instance, as I said in the experiment where you're looking at the screen and the pictures come up, we know that those pictures which have either erotic content or violence content, which evoke an emotional response, will produce greater dilation. But it isn't just erotic or violence. That's kind of a crude breakdown. To get a real sense of this, you look at, for instance, the work of English biologist Rupert Sheldrake, who took up a term that was developed about 50 years earlier called morphic fields or morphogenetic fields. And Rupert's idea was that individual acts of observation made it easier to do things. This is what Lyle Watson, who actually made it up, called the 100th monkey. And the idea is that if you, for instance, have mice run a program, a little labyrinth, that after the mice have done it for a while and get really good at it, that if it took all the original mice, let's say 3 minutes to run the labyrinth, after they get good at it, and then they get it down to, say, 2 minutes, all the mice that come after seem to do it faster, that none of them go back to the 3 minutes. There seems to be some kind of informational quality that the linkage amongst the mice share so that they can do it quicker. Or he looked at seed crystals and how long it took to form a seed crystal. There are a lot of different experiments. One of my favorites is done by Gary Schwartz, and another one almost at the same time by Alan Pickering. And this experiment, which is quite straightforward, Gary took Hebrew words, 48 Hebrew words, ranging from very old, frequently used highly charged words to very common words, say tabernacle and shovel. And then he created 48 fake words. That is like, instead of CAT, it would be TCA, but since they were written in Hebrew, you're standing there, am I running out of time?
No, you're fine. When you, on this subject, Jay-Z would like for you to share this particular subject relative to the card demo.
Oh, okay, sure.
While you're on the
Sure,
subject.
yeah, sure. Well, numinosity, let me just say in general, numinosity matters because the more numinous the target, the easier it is to see it. So I'll explain Gary's thing, and then I'll go into the thing about the cards. So in this experiment that he did, he had people who were non-Hebrew speakers or readers. He would flash the words, and the ostensible task that they were given in psychological experiments, a lot of times they give you an ostensible task that they don't expect you to complete because what they're really looking for is something else, and that's kind of like a sleight of hand. And in this case, the task that he set people was to look at these words and then to give a translation of them. And he didn't really expect anybody to be able to do it, and they couldn't. But then he asked people to rate the confidence that they had in their translation, how confident they were about what they were saying. And what he discovered was that the confidence level was not the same across the highly charged words that were real, the commonplace words that were real, and the fake words. Now remember, they're all written in Hebrew, so people actually can't read it, it's just symbols. And that the distribution was, the more emotionally charged the word, the more times that word had been used, and the emotional content of people who use the word, like tabernacle or Torah, those words got the highest confidence. The real words that were mundane got the next highest confidence, and the fake words got the lowest confidence. Alan Pickering, an English researcher, did the same thing, only he used Farsi. And another experiment has recently just been done using Chinese. And an even more interesting one has been done using advertising logos, in which they show people logos. Some of the logos are real logos, like the Coca-Cola logo, but they're all logos that come from other countries so that they're not familiar to people. And some of them are just made-up logos. And once again, those logos that have been the focus of intentioned acts of observation the most get the highest confidence, and those words which are fake words, which have been seen the least because they just got made up, have the lowest confidence. That the act of observation, particularly if the observation is in a heightened emotional state, produces a kind of informational density. And the denser the informational construct of these non-local architectures, the more easily they are perceived. That's how archetypes get created. If you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's The Hero of 1,000 Faces, he's describing how, although the differences in culture, you know, sometimes there's the mage, the warrior, the questing knight, the fair maiden, all that sort of thing. I mean, they look a little different in Japanese than they do in medieval English, but the underlying structure is the same. It's the hero of the thousand faces. And these archetypal forms occur because of reiterated acts of observation over and over and over, and they build in the non-local domain information architecture, structures. But see, structure is a physical word. And so this is one of those cases where I struggle to find the right words. Architecture is that's where I'm at now. Information architectures. This is what the Matrix got. The Wachowski brothers got this. William Gibson, in his novel The Neuromancer, get this. They describe this process, that in the non-local, reiterated acts of intentioned observation make things more numinous, or as Jung said, noumena, information, are psychic entia. It's not in space-time, it's in the non-local. Now, why is that important? Well, I got into this in a slightly different way. Because I was doing remote viewing experiments, and I had 21,000 people do an experiment. And when I went back through the data, I discovered something very odd. One of the pictures, these were targets that were places, and they were land-water interfaces, they were technological installations, they were religious shrines, they were cities, they were mountains, they were farmlands. One of those 6 categories. And I noticed that there was a picture of the USS Enterprise, the nuclear-powered carrier, the Enterprise. And there were several pictures of ships in this thing. And the way this experiment worked was the computer would select 7 targets, 1 in each category, and then you would attempt to remote view it. And what I discovered is that this particular target, the USS Enterprise, more than any other ship, or in fact almost more than any other target, people could get. It came up in the course of this study 27 times, and in 27 times, 23 of those times, people got a first place match. And I looked at this picture and looked at it, and I thought, what is it about this picture, which is not, it's just a picture of the ship bow on. What is it about this picture that makes it so easy to see? And I went back into the actual session data and read the descriptions that the people gave, and I noticed that no one called it a ship. It's too big. If you've ever seen a carrier, you realize that it's not like a ship. It's huge, it's like an island, and that's what people would call it, big metal islands. But they would say there's a star inside of this thing, or there's something incredibly hot that's in a bottle, or it's like there's a little sun in this thing. And I realized that what they were looking at was the nuclear reactor, the entropic process, the transition. And that got me to think about targets in general. And so this is a whole subject. I mean, really, this would be a whole evening. But to address this issue that Jay-Z's interested in, when you do remote viewing, or as I now would call it, non-local perception, basically all of the phenomena that people study break down into 2 categories: non-local perception and non-local perturbation, consciousness affecting matter. And even then, most of it, as I will get to in a minute, I don't think is actually perturbation, it's information. But in any case, when I began looking at this, I started looking at targets. Now, most of you know that scientific research in consciousness, which begins at the end of the 19th century, and which was really brought into a fuller flower by J.B. Rhine at the Rhine Research Center, where I was years later the director of research. He started with something called Zener cards. Stars, wavy lines, triangles, that sort of thing. And that they got people to try to guess what they were, or to remote perceive what they're non-locally perceive. And they discovered that people were pretty good at this when it was new and novel, but they dropped off enormously, what's called in the literature the decline effect. And they never could figure out what the decline effect was, but the more I looked at this and as I thought about this thing about the USS Enterprise, I thought the problem is these are really bad targets. That what made them work in the beginning was the novelty of the experience, and people were excited and novel. And in fact, when you go into the literature, you discover what's called the first time effect. And that is the first time you ask somebody to do a non-local perception, they tend to do very well. Why? Because it's incredibly novel, it's exciting, and they have no idea what it's going to be like, and so they have no defense mechanisms in their local cognitive mind saying, you can't do this. And so the Zener cards really are awful targets. I've never done playing card experiments, and so I don't really know about playing cards, but looking at them, they seem to me a very tough task. Not tough for the reason you might express, but that it's very hard to train yourself to constantly be up for guessing something which is not very numinous. It's hard to do. What we discover from the research is that the more numinous the target, the easier it is to see. In fact, it is such a strong effect that, as I discovered in my own experiments, if you put in a religious shrine, let's say the pyramids or Chartres Cathedral, into a target set, people will do what's called displacement. We have discovered in this research that there is a middle position between right and wrong. Right is you correctly describe the target. Wrong is you don't get any of the elements target right. And displacement is that you are drawn to something else in the target set that is more numinous for you. And let me illustrate this with an experiment. I was doing a set of object experiments, and we're going to do one in just a minute. What time do I have to stop? Well, all right, I'll just keep going. I want to do an experiment. I want to allow enough time, and I want to allow enough time for questions. So I just don't want to run over my time. Okay. So I'm doing this experiment, and in the experiment there are 7 objects. And the reason there are 7 is that it has to do with a statistical analysis. And so I have 7 objects, and I actually have about 120 objects. And each time the computer, they're in bags, and each time the computer, we do an experiment, a session, the computer randomly picks 7 of those objects that are orthogonal. When you put these experiments together, you want the targets to be very, very different from one another. You don't put an orange and a tennis ball in the same target set. Because if someone says, well, it's round and has a texture, I mean, how do you distinguish between the tennis ball and the orange? If they don't say it's orange, and they might not, round and has a texture would be equally good for the tennis ball or the orange. Whereas an inkwell in an orange, very different. They are called orthogonal. So the game is to put orthogonal targets in your target sets. Anyway, I'm just going to illustrate one session to make my point about this numinosity question and displacement. And these are interlinked, these three things. The target came up, there were 7 targets, and the woman who was the viewer said, well, it's tortoise shell, it's a frame, it has something that is clear that focuses light, it has little hinges. Now, you will note that she didn't say it was an eyeglasses, but that's obvious. I mean, everybody's got that. And that's one of the important things if you're going to do this sort of work. You are not being asked to identify what it is. That is a cognitive task. You are being asked to provide sense impressions describing the target. The hardest thing that separates a really accomplished viewer from a naive or unpracticed viewer is that our mind is designed to take a very limited amount of information and extract from it meaning. And this arose because it is genetically coded into us, because during the hunter-gatherer phase of our lives, thousands and thousands of years ago, if you're sitting hiding behind the rock looking at the trees, and you're sitting there waiting for the gazelle to come out, or the deer or the bear or whatever, well, the trees are just there. So you very quickly acclimate to them. What you're looking for is things which detect difference. And our whole neuroanatomy is designed to detect variations of difference. In fact, there are some scientists who believe that that capacity for detecting difference is how we construct reality. Now, to give you a sense of what I mean by this, if I were doing an experiment, can you guys over there, I guess you can see it on the television screens. If I were doing an experiment and I were flashing things and I said to you, what is this, what is this? If I flashed that, and if those were within about 18 inches, no more, less would be even better, you wouldn't say, well, it's 4 corners, you would say it's a square. Because your mind, your perceptual mechanisms catch this little bit of information and extrapolate the missing pieces. There is a researcher in California, Don Hoffman, who's been doing an enormous amount of research on how vision helps to construct reality, who's got a whole series of these experiments that he's been carrying out. I've only done a few of them. But the point I'm trying to make is our programming, the local mind programming, is about taking a limited amount of information and extrapolating meaning. And non-local perception is quite different, and you have to train yourself to do it because what it's trying to do is you get 2 kinds of information. You get sense impressions. It's smooth, it has texture, it's made out of one thing, it's made out of several things, it has a smell, there's a sound when you shake it, all that sort of stuff. And you have a sense of knowingness. That's getting information from the non-local that's not inherent to the physical structure itself. For instance, if you were viewing if I were doing a project to locate a shipwreck, in fact, let me use an actual experiment. I was trying to find a shipwreck. We did find it. I had people sitting in front of blank pieces of paper, which I would say to them, this represents a map. Let's just agree, we'll make an intention agreement. Because when you come in and sit down to do a session, what you are doing is forming an intention contract. Do you want to participate in my experiment? Yes. That's the intention contract. Remember your ritual ceremony protocol comparison? Then I say to you, okay, now the task I'm going to give you is to describe something. That's the formation of the intention. I don't want you to try to identify what it is. You may be able to do that. And I would say to you, write that and write debrief on the side, but don't get stuck on that, because what typically happens when people do this is that they get really focused. Once they get an image that it's a tennis ball, then everything they say afterwards comes out of the local mind, and it's everything they know about tennis balls. So what you have to train yourself to do is you get the sense impressions about the target, and you'll also get some knowingness. And in the case of the ship, for instance, one or several of the viewers said to me, there's an amethyst chandelier in the cabin of the captain. Now, you don't expect to hear that. And that's another part of this. We look for what are called low a priori observations. That is, if I ask you to locate a ship and you describe an anchor for me, well, anchors go with ships, so you would expect to get that. But you don't expect to get amethyst chandeliers. They didn't actually say chandeliers. What they would say is, well, there are these little drop-shaped things. I'd say, make a little drawing for me. And they're kind of purplish, and they all hang together in some way. They're like little pieces of glass. And lo and behold, when we found the ship, there was the chandelier. Now, you get a lot of information, this knowingness information, distinct from the sense impression information, that you can't check. The captain was thinking of his wife and daughter as the ship was going down. Well, unless he left a note or something, you just don't know that. And so there's a certain amount of information that may be right or may not be right. We just don't have the ability to evaluate it. Actually, about 40% of the data that people produce in these large, complicated targets, we just can't evaluate. Of the part we can evaluate, we expect to see between 75 to 85% of it be rated correct or partially correct when we're working with experienced viewers. Now, these cards, or the Zener cards, the problem with them is that they're not informationally very rich. You want targets that are richer, because informational architectures which are more informationally dense are easier to see. It's not that you can't see them. There were people that did wonderfully with Zener cards until they got bored, and then it just dropped off like a rock, the decline effect. But it's easier as a general proposition to see targets which are informationally denser. And you know, maybe this is a good place to stop for a minute. Oh, I didn't do entropic process. I'll do that, and then we'll do it. Because the only way to really understand this is to actually do it. So let me do an entropic process, and then we'll do it. The third thing that we understand about the non-local is this entropic process. Now, entropy means in standard physics movement toward disorder. But in non-local, it means that in a sense in non-local research, but what it really means in the non-local is transition from an informational, a static, or a stasis of informational architecture that is breaking down before reforming into something else. And in that example that I gave you about the carrier, what people were seeing was the nuclear reaction. That is the breakdown, literally the atomic breakdown. But entropic process can also be death. It could be a hugely transformative experience that breaks down existing informational structures. They are in transition. And it's in that transition space that people can see things easily. So, again, intention, attention. Learning how to focus, this is the will, focus on a task and to give one's full attention to it. You can do anything you want, the key is focus. Rumpf is right. Archery that you all are doing. Steve took me down there and showed me the archery thing, where you shoot the archery while you're blindfolded. In order to do that task, these are all very good tasks, by the way. I mean, I really want to say this, it's going on the record. I am very impressed with these exercises. It's not only that there's so many of you who've come such a far distance to sit in the tents in the rain, but that the things that you're doing, I understand why they're meaningful, because they are reflected in what we see both in science and that I see within the great shamanic traditions. They all have these same elements. When you strip away the dogma and you look at the processes, whether you're looking at a Shinto ritual or a Buddhist ritual or a Christian ritual or a Mayan ritual, once you get out of the dogma part, that's all created by human mind. When you get to these processes that empirically develop, they develop because people do them for thousands of years. Now, let me give you an example of this, because this is an important point. Years ago, when I was doing another kind of research, I ran across these Egyptian papyri, these medical papyri, the Ebers papyri, the Smith papyri, and the Kuhn papyri. And these are the oldest medical papyri we've got. And they were found at the early part of the 20th century. And as I was reading them, the translations of them, the archaeologists and anthropologists had done, one of the descriptions was, if you want to know whether a woman is pregnant, have her urinate on a bag of a flaxen bag containing barley and wheat. And if the seeds sprout, she's pregnant. And if there are more barley than wheat, it will be a boy, and more wheat than barley, it will be a girl. And the commentary that the translating Egyptologist wrote is, this is a typical example of Egyptian magical thinking. And I read that and I thought to myself, no. Nobody would make that up. I mean, you know, you're sitting around in your temple writing down what you know about medicine. Not a chance. So I began to I thought, I'm going to dig into this. And I went back into the medical literature. Now, the medical literature falls into two epochs in the modern age: pre-broad spectrum antibiotics and post-broad spectrum antibiotics. And if you that's from about the middle 40s with the development of penicillin, and out of that came the whole development of the pharmaceutical industries that we know today. And then there's all of the literature that was before that, which very good research in many cases, but completely abandoned because they felt they no longer needed it because, well, they had broad spectrum antibiotics. And so I went into this literature, and I dug back into the 30s and late 20s. And the first thing I found was a laboratory that reported, we're trying to develop a pregnancy test. And so it had recently been discovered that the urine of pregnant women contains a substance which we have discovered causes germination of seeds. And so that's their paper, is that we've discovered that the urine of pregnant women causes germination of seeds. They published. Another paper, a year or two later, a different country. We read the first paper and we wondered if the seeds themselves made any difference. And so we tried all kinds of seeds and we discovered that barley and wheat worked the best. And that if the barley sprouts more than the wheat, it's going to be a boy, and if the wheat sprouts more than the... And then a third paper, wait for it. Then a third paper that says, we read the first two papers, and we thought, well, you got to be able to package it in some way. I mean, it's kind of messy, just. So we tried a lot of containers. And we decided that bags of fabric would be the best because it would soak through. And so we tried all kinds of bags, and we discovered that flaxen bags. And so over a period of about 5 years, these three laboratories, with no reference at all to the Egyptians, had rediscovered what empirical observation by the Egyptians had taught them. You know, the thing about the pre-industrial people and going all the way back to the very earliest hominids is that these people were not stupid. They were, as particularly from modern humans on, they were as smart as we were. They just lived in a different way. There are a lot of ways to be a human being. Years ago, the Geographic sent me to spend time National Geographic sent me to spend time with the Kalahari Bushmen, the Kung Bushmen. And I at that time was teaching survival skills to people, woodcraft, that kind of thing. So I thought I was pretty cool. So when they invited me, they gave me this assignment. I thought, I can handle this. So I flew into Johannesburg, and then I got a little plane that hopped up to what was then called Southwest Africa, now called Namibia. And when I got to this little airfield, which was really remote, there was a guy there with a Range Rover, and I got into this Range Rover, and we just drove out into the Kalahari, which is a semi-arid land. It's sort of like, I don't know, maybe Joshua Tree or something. And we got out to this certain place, and he stopped, and out of some little shrubbery sort of thing around the way came this little group of people. Now, before I had gone to Africa, because I like research, I had gone around to the Smithsonian, and I had talked to all the guys who had written papers about the Kung Bushmen. They have a click language like that, right? And from all of them, I got what I came to know as the Little Brown Brother lecture. And the little brown brother lecture went sort of like this. They're primitives, they don't have any property, they don't even have any concept of property. They live in these little family groups, they don't have anything but a stick, or they're just very simple people. The little brown brothers, pat them on the head. So I got over, so there we are, I'm parked out in the middle of nowhere in this Range Rover with this guy who is kind of smirking, right? Yeah, right. And out comes this little group of people, and I'm going to spend about 10 days with them. And so I get out, and I've got my gear, you know, I've got all the very best gear, and we go off, and I'm with these people for about an hour when I realized I am such a klutz that I am literally endangering them by being with them. That they are completely attuned. I've got my compass and all this, and I notice that they're walking in a dead straight line, and they have nothing that I can see to guide them. And after we walk around, about this third day, you know, I'm kind of looking at my watch, I'm getting hungry. And John, I can't do it. John, I can't do it tonight, but anyway, his last name is a click, has a click with it, who was the only person who spoke any English. He watches me, and he looks at me and he says, "That is a beautiful slave bracelet." And I realized there are a lot of ways to be a sophisticated human being. So let me tell you just one more. A few years ago, up in the mountains of the Austrian-Italian Alps, they discovered a man who has come to be known as Asti the Iceman. And he was an extraordinarily well-preserved individual. At first they thought he was a modern person, and then they realized that he was not, that he was a very ancient, thousands and thousands of years. But he was perfectly preserved, and he had all of his gear and everything with him, and it all looked superficially to be quite primitive. I mean, we think of these as primitive people. Anyway, they brought the body down. You can go up and do a Google on Asti. There's lots and lots about him. It's a very interesting case. There have been several movies made. And when they were doing the examination of Asti and trying to figure out about him, one of the forensic anthropologists who was assigned to the team had a girlfriend who was an acupuncturist. And she went over one day, and there on his work table were these photographs of the body, and she was looking at them, and she noticed that there were these little teeny-weeny tattoos, little black dots that were on places on his body. And she said to her friend, "Those are acupuncture points. Those are acupressure points." No, he said, "This is thousands of years earlier, and it's not in China, and everybody knows acupuncture comes from China, and blah, blah, blah." And she said, "Nope, those are acupressure points, and when you do the autopsy, this is what you're going to find." That he had intestinal problems, he had an injury, a number of things. And lo and behold, when they did the examination of the body, he had all of those things. Somehow, acupuncture had developed thousands of years earlier than anybody thought, and that he had had his body tattooed so that he would know where to put the pressure. And she said to her friend, "You're going to find something in his kit bag which is going to look sort of like a thimble, but it's going to be more pointed, that he used to put the pressure on." And they went and they looked at his little kit bag, and sure enough, there it was. His shoes were of particular interest. They looked very primitive. They were packed with moss and were sort of net, and they had different kinds of soles. And everybody at first sort of dismissed this primitive footwear. But there was a Czech researcher who got interested in this, and he made these shoes and wore them and was astonished to discover how comfortable they were and how perfectly adapted they were to that environment. And so he made a bunch of these shoes, and he went to one of the leading athletic shoe designers and got their very highest level athletic shoe. And he got a bunch of volunteers to wear both kinds of shoes and then to report which was more comfortable in the circumstances. Do you want to guess who won? There are a lot of ways to be a human being and be very, very sophisticated. It's just a question of what you focus on. And part of what happens as you open to this non-local aspect of yourself is that you do begin to realize that we are all interconnected and interdependent, and that the choices we make create in large measure the reality we experience. So when we look at the narrative of human history, we need to divorce ourselves from these decisions about, these judgments about, well, these people are not our culture, or they're our primitive culture, or whatever. There are a lot of ways to be a human being. When we think about this, and you look, for instance, at the reincarnation research, the research of Ian Stevenson, or Jim Tucker, or Erlander Helsen, that's the best. You see over and over again this issue of information and its effect on the body. Because we know now that the consciousness that we hold has a psychosomatic effect on our body. Now, if you think about it, the placebo research that we all look at, everybody's familiar with placebo, the people that get the sugar pill. If you look at the placebo research across the arc of the placebo research, and there are literally thousands of studies, because this is the way all drug trials are done, what you discover, lo and behold, is that on average, 35% of the people do as well, who get the sugar pill, do as well or better than the people who get the medication. And that in fact, what is happening now is that in the psychoactive drugs, the psychiatric drugs, the difference between the placebo and the control is so small that it's within the error bars in some cases. And I'm actually writing a paper right now because I've discovered that this correlates exactly with the rise of pharmaceutical advertising on television. You know when you hear those ads on television and it says, this is going to be wonderful, except, well, it might be bad for your liver and could result in death, but it's wonderful. Well, what's happening is that people know what to experience, and they are mimicking it in the placebo community, the people who are the placebo recipients. If I were doing, for instance, a drug trial on, let's say your pancreas. Well, most people don't know where their pancreas is, and they don't know what it does. And yet we know that if we did a pancreas drug trial, that about 35 to 40% of the people would get a result that is as good or better than the people that get the medication. How do they know? How do people who don't cognitively know what their pancreas is or where it is or what it does still produce this effect? It's because of the non-local linkage. And in fact, if you dig a little deeper into it, you discover that when drugs are new, they do even better. Sometimes the placebo effect is 90%. And it drops and directly correlates to the fact that as the physicians do more and more trials and they begin to question the efficacy of the drug, they have doubts that the drop-off. Why? Because there is an intention contract between the people that do the research and the people who get the drug, and as doubts arise in the researchers, so the placebo response drops off. In fact, one French researcher said that if you want to get the best effect of a drug, you want to take it when it's new before everybody begins to question it. What this is also telling us is that we have the ability to control our bodies down to the cellular level. And that anybody that tells you that isn't true simply is not conversant with the literature. We can do this. We have the ability to reprogram ourselves. And that's part, again, of why meditation is important, because it allows us to reprogram this part of ourselves.